Chapter 2, A Killing Boom. By the turn of the new millennium, two major feuds, which would together claim more than 35 lives, were underway in Limerick and Dublin. Both were dubbed cocaine wars, but the reality was the gangs of Limerick and Dublin were also at war in a battle for supremacy in a world dominated by alpha males intent on winning their turf. Both feuds played out in small geographical areas where opportunities were rarely overlooked, and a fight to the death mentality provided a decade of work for hitmen paid handsomely for their services. Like Dublin, Limerick had its share of social problems, and the Dooley report had designated it, along with the capital, a murder black spot. Similar to the housing problems in Dublin, Limerick had concentrated large populations of uneducated and unemployed people in its city estates, resulting in high incidence of crime, addiction and disadvantage. Of the almost 20,000 houses in the city area, more than 8,000 were built by the council. First came St Mary's Park, known as the Island Field, built in 1934 to house those who'd been living in city slums. Throughout the 1970s and 1980s, in response to population growth, areas like Moyross and South Hill sprang up and became home to those who, even as the jobs came, were 5 times more likely to be unemployed than the national average. It was in an even more marginalised sector of society within that social exclusion, the travelling community, that a marriage would create a band of brothers whose mark will remain on the city of Limerick long after they are gone. Storm clouds surely gathered when Limerick couple Kenneth Dundon and Anne McCarthy wed in a ceremony in Hackney in London in 1982, an alliance which would spawn a murderous family unrivalled anywhere in Irish criminal history. The couple had met while still in school, but married in the UK after fleeing Limerick, where Kenneth had survived a shooting incident. Both came from families hardened by drink and violence, and each already had a long history of trouble with the law before their romance began. Kenneth in particular had a reputation for extreme and uncontrolled aggression. His first conviction for assault in Limerick dated back to 1974. Theirs was a stormy and violent relationship fuelled by severe alcohol dependency. After the marriage, 5 sons had followed in quick succession. First came Wayne in 1978, then Desi in 1981, followed by John, Gerard, Kenny Jr. and finally Annabel, the youngest and the only girl in the male-dominated family. There is little doubt but the Dundons were hardened from the crib and left to fend for themselves, and the only way they appeared to gain approval from their father was through violence. There were no boundaries when it came to giving a rival or an innocent civilian a severe beating. Wayne, Desi, John and Gerard were in trouble with the law from a very early age, and the family were the scourge of the local police in London, who, when they were not prizing Kenneth and Anne apart during their vicious arguments, were chasing after the boys for house burglary or violent assaults. The eldest son, Wayne, decided that he would set the bar for the rest to follow. He never smoked, drank or took drugs. His true addiction was inflicting pain. At one point as a young teenager, he gave his own mother such a severe beating she had to be hospitalised for weeks. Those who came into contact with him over the years describe a menace that radiates from him and cold blue eyes that are said to be completely vacant and show absolutely no emotion. His white, almost translucent skin only colours with rage, and when angry he regularly froths at the mouth. A top bare-knuckle street fighter, he was gifted with a punch of both speed and strength, and from the outset he was unquestionably the head of the family. At 18 years of age, Wayne was jailed for 4 years for a series of robberies from elderly people. During one, he savagely beat a wheelchair-bound pensioner, and in another he robbed and terrorised a 90-year-old woman. His choice of vulnerable victims who were unable to fight back meant that when he was due for release from prison, the UK's Home Office, the government department responsible for passports, crime, counter-terrorism and immigration, considered him so dangerous that it took the extraordinary step of deporting him back to Ireland. In the years that followed, the entire Dundon clan followed him back to their native Limerick and to the city centre social housing estate of Ballinacurra-Weston, where brothers Wayne, Desi and John managed to get neighbouring houses on the main Hyde Road. In Limerick, their cousins in the McCarthy mob were already a recognised crime family who had gone to war with brothers Kieran and Christy Keane, and their gang who, along with members of the Collopy grouping, controlled most of the lucrative drug supply into Limerick. Cousins Anthony Noddy McCarthy, Larry McCarthy Jr. and James McCarthy had already begun to get a small foothold in the drugs trade and were prepared to do anything to catch up with the Keane Collopy outfit and snatch their business. The Dundons' arrival gave the McCarthys the backup they needed to really show their rivals what they were made of, and as tensions grew, a deep-seated mentality of clan warfare set in. Familial groupings with blood ties, which had long been the backbone of some of the most notorious of the earliest Irish mobs, were all too evident in Limerick, and this was something that would challenge police into the new era of an ever more violent gangland. The concept of blood loyalty that Bronco Dunn had described years before was familiar throughout the world. The Jenna crime family, the Sicilian mafia of Chicago, was headed up by 6 brothers. In New York, the Gambinos and Genoveses were made up of siblings and cousins drawn together. In the UK, the Adams family, or the A-Team, led by brothers Terry, Sean and Patrick, terrorised Islington through drug trafficking and extortion and racking up more than 20 murders. Not long after the arrival of the Dundon brothers from England, an incident within the Keane mob would light a spark of the violence to come when Eddie Ryan, the one-time enforcer for the Keane Collopy mob, was gunned down at the city's Moose Bar. He'd once worked for the gang, but had become unhappy with his minor role. He'd tried to kill Christy Keane, but the gun jammed and his own death warrant was signed. After his death, the younger generations took on the fight, and tensions between the sons of Eddie Ryan and the second generation Keanes bubbled over. Unknown to them, the Dundons were watching the developments with interest and identifying a complex way to use Ryan's grieving sons to stamp out their opposition. Wayne Dundon meant business from the moment he returned to Limerick. In 2001, he sanctioned a hit on his own cousin John Creamer when there was a row over the proceeds of a jewel shop robbery, proving that he could turn on anyone who crossed him. Creamer was shot 15 times by an assassin, but survived. Throughout that year, there were dozens of shooting incidents linked to Dundon, but no fatalities. Wayne and his brothers ran roughshod over the neighbourhood of Ballinacurra-Weston, where they took total control. They'd pull young men from their beds and set them to work for them in whatever way they needed. They used their powerful fists to pulverise anyone who refused their bidding, and they created a fortified compound between their 3 houses, running neighbours from their homes and using the vacant buildings as stash houses for their drugs or lookouts for Gardaí. In 2002, the murder of innocent bouncer Brian Fitzgerald terrified the city of Limerick and showed police what the Dundons were capable of. The killing was ordered because Fitzgerald had stood up to Wayne Dundon and refused to allow the family's drugs be sold in the popular nightclub Docks, where he was head of security. As the months wore on, the Dundons strengthened their ties with their cousins, the McCarthys, and eyed up an opportunity to take a big scalp from the Keane Collopy grouping. In January 2003, Kieran Ryan and Eddie Ryan Jr., sons of the murdered enforcer Eddie Ryan Sr., were reported to have been abducted from a street in Limerick and bundled into a car. With tensions between the Ryan and Keane outfits at fever pitch, the Gardaí feared a double fatality, and the army was immediately drafted in on suspicion that the brothers were going to be tortured and killed. Despite the speed of the Gardaí's reaction and the resources pumped into the situation, hopes that the brothers would ever be found alive were beginning to fade. Then events took a sensational twist when Kieran Keane and his nephew Owen Tracy went missing too. Then the Ryan brothers showed up, unharmed, after being released by their captors, and were photographed celebrating with family and friends. Soon after, the body of Keane and the seriously injured Tracy were discovered at Drumbanna, a few miles outside Limerick. In a spectacular double cross, the Dundons had orchestrated the entire event. It emerged that Keane and Tracy had agreed to attend a prearranged meeting at which they thought they'd be liaising with those who'd taken the volatile Ryans. Despite the Dundons' efforts, brothers Kieran and Philip Colopy hadn't taken the bait. When Keane and Tracy arrived at the isolated roadside, they were jumped on by Desi Dundon, James and Anthony McCarthy and 2 others. Keane was tortured, then shot in the head. Tracy was stabbed 17 times and left for dead on the roadside. Miraculously, he survived to give evidence against the 5-man team who had plotted the Narco-style attack. John Dundon was already behind bars for threatening to kill Tracy when Desi got a life sentence for murder, along with his 4 co-accused. At the same time, Ger Dundon got a sentence for breaching bail and later for violent disorder and threatening a witness. A year later, Wayne joined his brothers when he got a 10-year sentence for threatening to kill a barman. The Dundon's sister, Annabel, had been just 14 years old when she was refused entrance to Brannigan's pub by barman Ryan Lee. Infuriated, Wayne had cocked his fingers in the shape of a gun, pushed them against Lee's face and warned him, "Fuck you, you're dead." 19-year-old Lee was shot just half an hour after the incident at the pub. The owner of the bar, Roy Collins, would later be gunned down in retaliation for the same incident. The years that followed would shine a light on the level of violence the Dundons were capable of inflicting, but they also gave an insight into the types of hitmen they unearthed in the city and beyond. Like other high-profile gang bosses, Wayne and John Dundon found themselves so heavily surveilled that, even though they were capable of murder, they had to hire freelancers to carry out their bidding to keep themselves at arm's length from the crime. Limerick, like Dublin, had a history steeped in IRA activity, but was also the southern headquarters of the dissident grouping Continuity IRA. It had been established in 1986 after a split in the Provisional IRA, but had been very active since 1994, when it began a campaign in Northern Ireland against the British Army and the PSNI. The links between Limerick and the north provided a supply route for guns and easy access to firearms training for those interested in the art of killing. Gary Campion first came to public attention in 2006 when he was charged, along with a number of other men, with the 2002 murder of Brian Fitzgerald, the 34-year-old father of 2 who had refused to let the McCarthy-Dundon gang sell drugs in the nightclub where he worked as head of security. He would likely have got away with it were it not for English contract killer James Cahill, who confessed to the murder. Before he was jailed for life, Cahill implicated Campion and John Dundon in the killing. He gave evidence in court outlining how Campion drove him to and from the murder scene on a motorbike, a job for which he was paid €10,000. Cahill was an unusual character. He hailed from Birmingham, but he had been brought up in County Clare, where he came into contact with associates of the Dundon mob. He was just 30 when he was hired by the Dundon gang and had already had previous convictions for firearms offences. He'd gone to Fitzgerald's house at Brookhaven Walk in Corbally in the early hours one morning and, along with Campion, lay in wait for him in the bushes, pouncing when Fitzgerald returned home from work. Fitzgerald fought with the pair, then a number of shots were fired and he fell to the ground, injured, and tried to crawl away. Cahill pursued him and shot him in the back of the head. In prison, Cahill had had a road to Damascus moment, sparked by fear that he was going to be killed, and from his cell in Portlaoise had asked to speak to Gardaí, telling them, "They're going to kill me." He made a request to be transferred to a more secure location before he confessed to the murder and named Campion and others involved. He told Gardaí, "I shot him and no one else. I want to get this out of my system. I want to get this out in the open." Despite Cahill's desire for his co-conspirators to pay the price for the murder of Fitzgerald, John Dundon was acquitted of the crime. Campion, however, was convicted and jailed for life in 2007. In the periods of freedom he'd enjoyed before going to prison, he'd been kept busy. Just 4 weeks after the killing of Fitzgerald, he'd played a role in the McCarthy Dundon's murder of car dealer Sean Poland during a botched robbery at his home in County Clare on New Year's Eve. Campion, who was only 19 at the time, and another man had soon emerged as chief suspects. Less than 5 months later, Campion was implicated in the murder of Robert Fitzgerald, a 23-year-old who was shot in the head because he'd associated with people in the Keane Mulready gang. In 2006, Campion shot Fat Frankie Ryan, a member of the McCarthy Dundon gang, in a personal dispute which angered his paymasters. A judge struck out that high-profile murder case a year later, but Campion's brother Noel was shot dead by the Dundons in revenge, and he was soon in the dock on the Fitzgerald murder. While remorseful killers like Cahill, plagued by voices in their head and a terrible desire to confess, are rare, gunmen like Campion are far more typical of the type of hitman that gangs can find in the impoverished communities where they operate. Like Campion, many are both organised and disorganised criminals, often capable of killing either to order or on a whim. Their backgrounds are often steeped in violence, and in most cases they have come from troubled homes. Campion came from a family entrenched in violence. His brother, William Jr., was sentenced to life in prison for the murder of Patrick Skehan, a 68-year-old bachelor farmer from County Clare, who was found beaten and unconscious in his home, his hands and legs bound with cable wire, hanging upside down from the banisters. Another brother, Noel, was a convicted armed robber. Gary started out robbing cars and selling drugs, but soon got weapons training and found he was handy with a gun. He was only 19 when he became the chief suspect in the Poland killing. Campion enjoyed the kill, and in 2000 he abducted 2 Limerick brothers, stripped them and was about to shoot them when Gardaí arrived. In another case, he made so many attempts to kill a young man that the target was so terrified that he took his own life. Many killers like Campion travel to Eastern Europe to learn how to use a gun. Others are trained by the IRA terrorists who have gone before them. Ireland is steeped in expertise when it comes to sourcing weapons and using them, thanks to the troubles in the north and the twisted job opportunities it brought. And while the Provisional IRA would never admit to training killers for anything other than the cause, or having anything to do with the world of drug dealing, many of its members found a good source of income by passing on their skills in bomb making, gun handling and crime scene destruction methods. One criminal godfather made a career as a murder coach, teaching his young protégés everything he knew, from destroying evidence to dismembering and burying bodies. Sean Hunt, nicknamed the Smuggler, was an IRA boss who moonlighted as a pigeon fancier and pet store owner. He first took Eric Lucky Wilson under his wing when he met the psychopathic killer in his native Ballyfermot. He acted as an agent for him and trained his older brother John and his younger brother Keith, along with their cousin Alan and later a nephew Luke. The story of the Wilson clan and their incredible family business would send chills down the spine of the most hardened investigator. Reared in Ballyfermot, where the likes of Factory John Gilligan, John the Colonel Cunningham and George the Penguin Mitchell had started their empires, the boys were brought up by their mother and were long rumoured to have been fathered by Martin the General Cahill, a notorious womaniser who romanced 3 sisters and had children with all 3. Hunt had an eye for a natural born killer, and he took the fatherless Eric under his wing, teaching him the mechanisms of a gun, how to shoot a moving target and how to flee the scene of a kill. Eric had a reputation as being cold-blooded, and by the time he walked into the home of his one-time best friend and shot him dead beside his girlfriend, he was fully skilled in the craft of murder. Eric was only 21 when he fell out with his childhood pal Martin Kenny, and he was out to settle a score when he broke into Kenny's girlfriend's family home and appeared at the end of their bed at 5 a.m. The killing put Eric firmly in the sights of a notorious criminal sadist known as Mark the Guinea Pig Desmond, a cousin of Kenny, who vowed to take revenge on his killer. Desmond was one of the most feared figures in the Ballyfermot area where he lived and ruled. He was behind a string of murders, including the double assassination of 19-year-old Patrick Murray and 20-year-old Darren Carey, whose bodies were discovered in January 2000 in the Grand Canal in Kildare. Killings that would serve as a macabre message of what was to lie ahead in the new millennium. Desmond, then 24, had carried out the killing himself. He was known as a dealer and an enforcer who raped teenage boys as a way of controlling them and terrifying them into collecting his debts and dealing his drugs. He was notorious in his community, as had been his father before him. He was known as a violent bully and a close associate of the General. Eric Wilson was wary rather than afraid when Desmond let it be known that he was going to avenge his cousin's death. Wilson moved away for a cooling-off period on the advice of his mentor, the smuggler Hunt, and lay low until the dust settled. A year after killing his best pal, Eric had picked up work from Finglas drug trafficker Martin Marlowe Hyland. A decade after his former boss, PJ Psycho Judge, was taken out, Hyland had built an even bigger empire for himself in Finglas, a suburb of North Dublin. Hyland had specialised in armed robberies using a network of young criminals known as the Filthy 50, who he'd hire for jobs and pay them according to the profits made or the success of the robberies. He'd used the money to purchase large amounts of drugs, including cocaine and heroin, and in the 10 years since the murder of Judge in 1996, he'd become so powerful and rich that Gardaí had set up a special task force to target him. Called Operation Oak, the multi-pronged move against Marlowe Hyland had sprung out of a wider Garda initiative called Operation Anvil, established in 2005 to tackle Dublin's gun crime, which had identified just how massive Hyland's operation had become. Throughout 2006, the Hyland network was torn apart by countless arrests and charges brought against 20 members of his inner circle. More than €20 million worth of drugs had been seized, along with guns. As his paranoia grew, Hyland's ferocious temper turned on his own. In 2006, he hired Eric Lucky Wilson to carry out the murder of a County Louth drug dealer, Paul Ray, who he suspected of being a Garda informer and therefore part of his ongoing problems. Despite being mentored by Hunt, who was notoriously clever with money, Lucky Wilson accepted a kilo of cocaine as payment for the cold-blooded killing. As Hyland's gang continued to crumble, he desperately clung on to his power, networking with the McCarthy Dundon gang in Limerick and arranging the shocking murder of mother of two, Biba Salute, for a man who wanted her dead. Hyland himself would end the year dead in a bed in Scripplesdown Park in Finglas, where he was shot as he slept. That attack also claimed the life of an innocent young plumber, Anthony Campbell, aged 20, who was working in the house when the killers came for Hyland. Ironically, Hyland's bloody demise came in exactly the same way as his rise had, through the ambition of an underling. A decade after Hyland had taken over his murdered boss Judge's turf, Eamon the Don Dunn had moved in to get rid of the old guard and take his throne. Eric Lucky Wilson was an odd, lonely character who was a prolific user of cocaine, which marred his judgment when it came to his work. In 2007, he shot the criminal Roy Coddington, who was under threat of arrest, because he feared he would reveal his involvement in the Ray killing. In confirmation that the carefully balanced underworld operates just like a game of chess and that every move means a shift in position for others, the murder of Coddington would spark significant power changes in the drugs landscape that would have far-reaching effects into the future. Coddington was, along with Ray, the other big supplier in Meath, and as a direct result of the two murders, a merger of two groups would fill the power vacuum. Traveller brothers Owen and Brendan Maguire had ruled a patch in the Drogheda area of Louth and had long-standing links with Cornelius Price, who lived in a compound in Gormanston in County Meath. With Coddington out of the way, the two groupings who had similar backgrounds saw an opportunity to up their supply chain and increase their importance by working together. They quickly moved in to mop up the spoils, forming an alliance that would be marked out in blood. After the Meath murders of Coddington and Ray, Lucky Wilson moved to Spain, where the smuggler Hunt helped him find an isolated farmhouse in Coyne, where he based himself while offering up his services as a killer. Hunt let the mobs know that Lucky was available for business in Ireland or Spain. The Kinahan organised crime group, based in nearby Portabanus, always needed a skilled killer, and he soon picked up a number of jobs from them, including a trusted role in a hit on career criminal Paddy Doyle in 2008. Doyle was himself on the lam in Spain, where he'd been living for 3 years. A notorious figure in the Irish criminal underworld, he'd been the personal hitman and enforcer-in-chief for Fat Freddie Thompson throughout his murderous feud with rival Brian Rattigan in the Crumlin and Drimnagh areas of southwest Dublin. Rattigan and Thompson had once been friends, but they'd gone to war after their gangs split, and both took leadership roles in what was Ireland's first real cocaine war. Doyle fled Ireland in November 2005 after carrying out the murders of Noel Roach, Darren Gagan and Gavin Byrne in just 2 days. While Roach was a rival of Thompson, Gagan and Byrne were not. They believed they were meeting Doyle to discuss a drugs delivery. Instead, the cool, calculated killer had got into the back seat of their car and shot both in the back of the head at point-blank range with a 9mm pistol. Doyle had already proved himself a willing assassin when in 2002 he'd murdered 18-year-old Timothy Rattigan outside his home. He'd also shot Brian Rattigan that same year in his bed, leaving him injured and having to wear a colostomy bag. Months later, Rattigan's beloved younger brother Joey was shot dead after celebrating his 18th birthday. Doyle had the typical personality of a hitman. He was a wild card and feared nobody. He was unpredictable and impulsive, which for many made time spent in his company fun. In Spain, his disrespectful attitude angered mob boss Daniel Kinahan, the heir to the throne Christy Kinahan Sr. had built following his ambitious rise from gangland nobody to mafia-style boss. When Doyle was accused of both owing money and being a liability, his fate was sealed. On the day of his murder, he was double-crossed by his two best friends he believed he could trust with his life, Freddie Thompson and his childhood pal Gary Hutch. Hutch, a nephew of the legendary criminal Jerry the Monk Hutch, was living his best life on the Costa after merging with the Kinahan grouping and forging a close friendship with Daniel Kinahan, which had seen him elevated to senior lieutenant in the mob. Although he had known Doyle since they were schoolboys and knew his parents, Gary Hutch was prepared to personally oversee the murder as a measure of his loyalty to Kinahan. Daniel Kinahan sat down with Thompson and Hutch to plan the end of Doyle so they could make it look like another mob had carried it out. Thompson and Hutch needed to be with Doyle when he came under fire, Kinahan suggested, so there could be no rumours that it had been an in-house job. After making an agreement with Lucky Wilson to pull the trigger, the intricate conspiracy was put together, and it was planned to lure Doyle out so that Lucky could strike. Hutch and Thompson knew Doyle well, and when they arranged for the electricity to be turned off at his Spanish home, they were confident that he would quickly get bored and phone them to arrange a rendezvous. Sure enough, within minutes of the power cut, Doyle called the pair and asked them to collect him so they could go to the gym until his power was back. Hutch drove the car while Thompson chatted to Doyle. Then they stopped at a pre-arranged place and Lucky appeared on the pavement outside the bar and started to shoot into the 4x4. As the bullets flew, Hutch and Thompson abandoned the vehicle and Doyle died in a hail of gunfire. Within hours of his death, the Kinahans filtered out word that Doyle had been killed by a Turkish gang, angered that he owed them money. To confirm the story, they even sent Gary Hutch home with money to pay for his funeral and to carry his coffin. In Spain, Lucky Wilson returned to Coyne, where he bedded down in his lonely farmhouse and waited for his next payday. Months later, Doyle's younger brother Barry, raw with grief and terrified that he'd be targeted too, took solace in the arms of the McCarthy Dundon mob in Limerick. He knew Ger Dundon, the youngest of the brothers, and gambled that he'd be safe under their protection. But it wasn't long before they turned him into a killer too. Years into their murderous feud with the rival Keane Collopy gang, the older Dundon brothers, Wayne and John, had not satisfied their bloodlust, and they ordered the murder of John Pitchfork McNamara. Doyle had enjoyed their protection, used their drugs and stayed at their homes, but in the Dundons' world nothing in life comes free, and this was time for him to pay back his debt. Fuelled by a cocktail of drugs, Doyle was no skilled marksman, and when he was delivered to the neighbourhood where McNamara lived, he panicked and shot the wrong man. Instead of the intended target, he killed the innocent rugby player Shane Geoghegan, a murder that would shock the country and result in a renewed crackdown on the mobs of Limerick. In custody, he admitted to the murder during his 15th interview, and as he did, he took a pair of rosary beads from his neck, a memento of his dead brother, and asked Gardaí to give them to the grieving Geoghegan family as a mark of his remorse. He was 26 years old when he was handed down a life sentence. Back home, another Wilson was appearing on the Garda radar. Lucky's cousin Alan was about to prove that bad blood ran through his veins too. In 2008, a teenage beggar girl was lured into a car on the promise of a McDonald's meal. She disappeared after making a panicked call to her family back in Romania. Mariora Rostas had just arrived in Dublin and she'd little English and no way of knowing where she was when she told a relative she'd been kidnapped and was being held in a house. Alan Wilson's best pal, Fergus O'Hanlon, would later lead officers to a house in the South Inner City and then to Mariora's body, buried deep in the Dublin mountains, wrapped tightly in plastic and bound with duct tape. Wilson would be tried but acquitted of the crime, whispering thank you to the jury who found him not guilty. Within months, he'd have murder on his mind again. In Spain, Lucky Wilson wasn't out of work for too long. Drug dealer Micah the Panda Kelly, one of the most prominent bosses of the underworld, knew he needed a reliable and violent assassin when he cooked up a plan to kill a drug debt as well as two prolific dealers who had been demanding payment from him. Kelly, who had a big drug operation in Coolock, had been feuding with Belfast drug traffickers David Babyface Lindsay and his associate Alan Napper for months. They were insistent that he pay them up to £1 million for a drug shipment that had gone awry. Kelly decided to call their bluff and made arrangements to meet the pair in a house in rural County Down, where he said he would bring the cash. Making his way north from Dublin, Wilson flew to Belfast on a false passport and followed directions to the house, where he bedded down and lay in wait. When the two arrived at the pre-arranged location, Wilson shot them both. Later, he and Kelly cut up their bodies with a chainsaw and buried them. They've never been found. Lucky made his way back to Spain again, while the smuggler Hunt negotiated his next job. Hunt had never seen so much business from a single family. He guided all the Wilson boys, regularly finding jobs for them through a network of connections that spanned the Republic and Northern Ireland. As part of his agent role, he allowed them use his luxury villa in Spain as a place to lie low after hits, and the holiday became part of their pay. Eldest brother John was just 24 when he worked as a getaway driver in the murder of Simon Doyle in West Dublin, a role brokered by Hunt. The third brother, Keith, was contracted to murder Daniel Gaynor, himself a hot-tempered hitman who'd been responsible for at least 4 murders. Gaynor had lived and died by the gun, but had fallen foul of Eamon the Don Dunn, who was fast becoming the biggest employer of killers in town. Not only had Dunn's takeover of his former boss Hyland's business been ruthless, but he had brought to it an even more paranoid and dangerous attitude than before. Dunn was an associate of Hunt and trusted him to provide him with proficient guns for hire over a murderous 4-year reign as the North Side's most feared gang boss. In 2009, he employed Lucky Wilson to help him solve a problem in Spain. Christy Gilroy had worked as a hitman for Dunn in the ruthless double murders of Michael Rowley Cronin and James Maloney at Summerhill in Dublin. Cronin was a heroin dealer accused of being one of George the Penguin Mitchell's biggest wholesalers in the North Inner City. Dunn was no community activist and didn't care about the damage that was being done by heroin, but he wanted the dealers out of the way in revenge for perceived slights to him. Gilroy was himself hooked on heroin and made mistakes during the kill. He'd arranged to meet Cronin and Maloney under the pretence of doing a drug deal and had got into the back of their car to shoot them both. But in the panic of the getaway, he'd thrown the murder weapon and his clothing under a car close to the crime scene. They'd been found by Gardaí and held as forensic evidence that could link Gilroy to the double murder, which would in turn jeopardise Dunn as his employer. After the murders, Gilroy had been flown out to Spain to get specialist treatment for his addiction, but Dunn had instead got Lucky Wilson to collect him, kill him and disappear his body. What happened next would prove how Lucky's lonely and sinister existence in the farmhouse at Coyne had turned him into a monster in every sense of the word. Aged just 26, Wilson was on a night out in the lounge bar in Riviera del Sol near Mijas in 2010 when he groped a young girl. British tourist Dan Smith, who was 24, told Wilson to stop and the pair pushed and shoved one another around the bar before Lucky fled on a motorbike, vowing to return to finish the fight. The bike blasted up the road to Coyne, and sometime later Wilson returned to the bar, pulling out a 9mm pistol and shooting Smith twice in the crowded pub as he attempted to get up from his seat. 11 times the furious Wilson pulled the trigger as shocked revellers looked on. Less than 48 hours after the attack, he was arrested at his farm, where Spanish police found explosives, grenades and fake passports. Searching his rented home, officers also found electronic detonators and cylinders filled with explosives in a bedside chest of drawers. After years of murdering, the writing was on the wall for the Wilsons. In 2011, Keith Wilson, then 23, was sentenced to life in prison for the shooting of 25-year-old Daniel Gaynor. That same year, Lucky was handed down 23 years for the murder of Smith. And 1 year later, John Wilson was gunned down in front of his 7-year-old daughter, leaving just Alan and young Luke under the management of Hunt. In Spain, the Kinahan mob were ramping up their own activities, and Daniel Kinahan decided he had a new job opportunity. An in-house killer who would work for him full-time and be paid a bonus every time his services as an assassin were required. The expansion of the Kinahan network was about growing, but also about keeping business decisions within a tight-knit and trusted team. Kinahan found that there were plenty of takers from his own inner circle of childhood friends and those of his closest associates when it came to making a living from the gun. Among the boxing enthusiasts and street fighters he'd surrounded himself with was James Quinn, a skilled fighter who had been blooded by his uncle Martin the Viper Foley, who'd often brought him to off-grid bare-knuckle bouts in the mountains outside Dublin when he was growing up. Quinn had been reared in the Oliver Bond flat complex where the Kinahan boys, Daniel and Christopher Jr., lived with their mother Jean Boylan, a cleaning lady. Quinn was very close to Boylan, who'd regularly fed him as a child and shown him kindness. He kept a dog-eared picture of her in his wallet and referred to her as his surrogate ma. Quinn had amassed a string of convictions for violent assaults and regularly threatened bouncers and Gardaí after getting into incidents in pubs in the city. But he was looking for a chance to get out of Dublin and live the expensive Costa lifestyle that the Kinahans were enjoying. His temper meant he wasn't an ideal candidate for the business end of the drugs business, which required a degree of self-control. At one point in 2008, Quinn was so incapable of managing his emotions that he'd warned a doorman he'd be sorry for putting him out of a pub and returned later with a hammer and smashed the windscreen of a Garda car. Around the early 2010s, Quinn had started spending more and more time in Spain, where he worked as a driver for Kinahan and where he finally found his role in the mob, kept on a retainer to kill. The Kinahan cartel were a very structured grouping with pay rates for everything from transport to murder, and they'd at least 2 other Dubliners operating as hitmen and working on a bonus scheme. Both had young families and wives and somehow managed to compartmentalise their work from their seemingly ordinary existence. But Quinn threw himself into the life of a high-flying gangster, living on a yacht and flashing his cash on drugs, fast cars, high-end watches and women. While gang leaders and drug wholesalers had no moral problem with ordering a killing, few did the dirty work themselves, largely because of the mandatory life sentence that awaited them should they be caught. Unlike the never-ending stream of youngsters willing to stand on a street corner as a lookout or hold or transport drugs, killers were a more finite group. Gang leaders with ambition needed trusted hitmen, so they tended to favour killers from within their own inner circle. In Coolock, a rising star in gangland had, like Daniel Kinahan, employed from within his tight group of childhood friends. The mobster known as Mr. Big was a powerful force, and his secret weapon was the killer, Kenneth Finn, in whom he had total trust and who was a loyal servant when it came to the business of crime. Finn was a debt collector for Mr. Big, a master at armed robbery and tiger kidnapping while still in his 20s. Tiger kidnapping is the abduction, usually from an institution such as a bank, of a high-value individual who's then kept as ransom until demands for money are met. Just like Marlow Hyland, Mr. Big was using the profits to invest in drug wholesaling, which was making him very rich and powerful. He had a fearsome reputation on the estates where he'd grown up, and with Finn at his side, he was fast gaining a reputation as one not to cross. When Minister Michael McDowell told his cabinet colleagues at a briefing in 2006 that there was to be a major crackdown on suspected members of drug gangs across Dublin City, he insisted there was no Mr. Big. However, Big's outfit were the chief suspects for the murder that sparked the operation, that of 22-year-old father of one, James Perdue, the 6th murder in the North Dublin area in a matter of months and the 29th that year. Perdue had been gunned down as he returned to his apartment in Donamead. Just 2 weeks earlier, Keith Fitzsimons, 23, had been shot dead as he stood in his garden in a case of mistaken identity. Both were accused of owing money to Big and his pals. Like most gang bosses, Mr. Big was ambitious. He'd come up through armed robbery and tiger kidnapping in a traditional route to drug supply that had taught him valuable lessons in how to outfox the Gardaí, remain alert at all times and leave nothing to chance. He'd formed part of a large grouping from Coolock that had worked in the dust of the likes of Micah the Panda Kelly and his pal Paul Burger Walsh, along with Sean Dunn. Dunn was a fraudster and dealer who'd used a complex VAT scam to raise money to buy large consignments of drugs, turning him into a multimillionaire property owner in both Ireland and Spain before he'd vanished without trace on the Costa Blanca. Mr. Big had a clear vision for himself as a leader and not an underling, and he had the sense to respect those above him, not go to war unnecessarily, and to wait for opportunities rather than rush in. He had very carefully built up contacts, north as well as south of the border, and was deeply embedded in his own community of Coolock, where he had grown up. MacDowell's promise of changes to legislation and more Garda recruitment sounded exciting and positive for those fighting organised crime from swish offices and at fancy desks. But on the ground, officers on the beat had noticed an ever more violent situation developing throughout the noughties as the demand for cocaine soared and the economy boomed. There had always been headbangers involved in organised crime, but it seemed a new breed of thugs, fuelled by their own cocaine supply, were becoming far more trigger-happy when it came to solving a dispute or even finishing an argument. Most of them were coming of age and being spat out of those massive social housing estates, built as a beacon of hope by long-retired politicians and power brokers for a new generation. Robbie Lawler was exactly the type of new breed gangster that the 1980s drug kingpin Larry Dunn had warned the court about when he was finally sent down. Born in 1985, Lawler had grown up in Fox Hill in Coolock on Dublin's north side. Although he came from a close-knit family with 2 sisters and a brother, by the time he was a young teenager, Lawler was out of control, unpredictable and known to Gardaí as being involved in car thefts and small-time drug dealing. The family had moved into the area as part of the slum clearance of the North Inner City. His mother, Celia's second relationship, was with the taxi driver Paul Dillon, and she changed her name when she remarried. Lawler was a classic teen soldier for the gangs around the area. He was known as a loose cannon, happy and good fun one minute and ferocious and dangerous the next. He dropped out of school, unable to deal with its authoritarian structure, and, quick to take offence, fell out with childhood friends. Those who knew him knew to walk on eggshells around him and avoid stoking that hot temper that was always bubbling to the surface. It was that reckless approach to the world and his total unpredictability that would go on to make him an indiscriminate killer, motivated by both money and personal grievances. Lawler was a vain sort too, spending a lot of time honing his physique in the gym. He was a ladies' man, but teenage sweetheart Rachel Kerwin was his number one girl, and he charmed and terrorised her in equal measures. At 17, he was before the courts for dealing drugs and quickly racked up 3 more convictions for possession, road traffic offences and charges relating to stolen vehicles. By 19, his quick temper had got him a name in Garda circles as one to approach with caution. He was brought to Swords District Court that year after giving a false name and address when stopped, and a judge was told he had been so violent that it had taken 3 officers to restrain him. On that occasion he was fined, but he spent the next few years in and out of prison and would ultimately amass more than 124 convictions during his life of crime. His first murder would tell Gardaí a lot about the individual, who would go on to become an enemy of the state, largely because of the motive, the planning and the execution. Mark Byrne was 31 and serving a sentence for robbery when in May 2005 he was granted temporary release on compassionate grounds because of a family issue. Byrne had pedigree as a criminal. He was from Kilcarrig Green in Talla and had served time in Portlaoise, where he had befriended the notorious John Gilligan. At one point he had escaped custody while on a hospital visit, and he was well able to handle himself in the rough and tumble of life behind bars. Like Lawler, he was hot-headed, and the two had clashed at Wheatfield Prison, where they were both serving time. The older man had overpowered Lawler and believed he had put him in his place. Byrne had no clue just how long Lawler could hold a grudge, or indeed how well connected he was within the prison system, even at the tender age of 20. When Byrne was granted his temporary release, he had no idea that fellow lags were using smuggled mobile phones to stay in touch with Lawler. who had made it known he was happy to pay for any information he could get on Byrne and his movements. At 10 a.m. on the 4th of May 2005, the door of Mountjoy training unit opened and Byrne strolled out into the late spring sun. He walked a few hundred metres to a newsagent on the junction of Vincent Street and Berkeley Road, where he bought credit for his mobile phone. As he walked out of the shop, he was approached from behind and shot at point-blank range as commuters and shoppers looked on in terror. Witnesses would later tell Gardaí investigating the murder about a cool, calm and ruthless killer who escaped on foot. They described seeing the man, wearing dark clothing, a hoodie and a baseball cap, approaching Byrne from behind as he was preoccupied with his phone. Officers were told that witnesses heard firing and saw him fall to the ground. He tried to scramble away on his hands and knees, but the hooded man stood over him and shot again. Such was the force of the impact of that bullet that it flipped him over. The gunman calmly leaned down to check his victim was dead before running away. The execution of such a hardened criminal shocked Gardaí, who knew immediately that Lawler, who had been released from prison just months earlier, was their chief suspect. A joint investigation got underway both inside and outside the prison, with 112 witness statements taken. Lawler was arrested and questioned, but like a veteran, he refused to cooperate or answer any questions that officers had for him. The murder was the 5th gangland killing of the year and placed the focus on smuggled phones in prison and what they were being used for. Months after Byrne's murder, a criminal trial was told that the killing of Paul Warren, 24, on a night in February the year before, had been directly coordinated by a prisoner using a smuggled phone. Warren was drinking at a bar in Gray's pub at Newmarket Square off Cork Street when two masked and armed men burst into the premises shortly before closing time. One of the men shot at him in front of terrified customers as he fled to the toilets for safety. He was gunned down before he could find shelter from the bullets. Warren was a suspect in the murder of Joey Rattigan, carried out by the hitman Paddy Doyle. Rattigan's brother Brian was then serving a prison sentence, but officers believed he had ordered and directed Warren's assassination from behind bars. The hit on Warren was carried out by John Roach, who would in turn be shot dead within a year. Mobile phones had for years been thrown over the perimeter walls of the jail to prisoners in the exercise yards, but netting had put paid to that. Authorities now feared that newer and smaller phones were entering the jails, concealed internally by criminals, on committal or by those returning after periods of temporary release. Once smuggled in, they were being concealed in cells, in the U-bends of toilets and down drain holes, and they were being used to facilitate the arrangement of murders and drug deals. In the aftermath of Byrne's murder, new camera technology was being tested, including guided lenses that could be placed down water pipes and other hard-to-search areas. Weeks after Robbie Lawler killed his first victim, Justice Minister Michael McDowell claimed that gangland crime was dissipating and those involved in the activity were on the back foot. He also promised that Operation Anvil would strike at the heart of Dublin's gun culture. The new operation, he explained, gave the Gardaí an extra 15,000 hours of overtime per week to investigate gang leaders who had ordered a spate of killings and armed robberies. A budget of €6.5 million had been set aside to strike at the heart of Dublin's growing gun culture. Despite their efforts, Gardaí could not find enough to charge Lawler. 3 years after Byrne's murder in 2008, a coroner's court would hear that the Director of Public Prosecutions had ruled that there was not enough evidence against the identified shooter. Coroner Dr. Brian Farrell described the murder as a particularly cruel shooting and obviously a targeted one. While Lawler wasn't named at the inquest, he was during a Dublin District Court hearing in October of that year, when it was disclosed that Lawler, who was then 22 years old, had been arrested as a suspect in the shooting of another man, Anthony Iodeji, in Darndale the previous July, and that his girlfriend Rachel Kerwin, 24, had been quizzed about withholding information. The attempt to kill Iodeji had been a truly shocking gun attack that had sparked a political outcry in a country that had seen a decade of bloody gang wars between rival gangs in Crumlin in Dublin and in Limerick, where the McCarthy Dundon gang had gone to war with the rival Keane Mulready-Woods outfit. Iodeji had been holding a baby boy and sitting in a car when he was blasted with 5 shots through a window of the Volkswagen Golf. The baby was covered in blood and glass, but miraculously escaped death and serious injury. Iodeji took 3 bullets and was rushed to hospital in critical condition. Witnesses said they'd seen a masked gunman walk calmly up Buttercup Park in Darndale towards the car before raising his weapon. The car had been parked near a green area surrounded by houses, and while people rushed out when they heard the gunshots, the would-be killer had made his getaway. Lawler had been arrested and questioned about the shooting of Iodeji, who was of Lebanese origin and who had been minding the 22-month-old son of a female friend at the time of the shooting. But again, officers didn't have enough to charge him with the crime. In the case of Iodeji, the motive again appeared to be a personal grievance. Months after the shooting, Rachel Kerwin, Lawler's girlfriend, had launched a court bid to have her car returned to her, resulting in the pair being named before the court as suspects in the crime. Their Volkswagen Passat had been seized by Gardaí investigating that shooting, as they believe it had been used to carry Lawler to and from the scene. Kerwin had brought the police property application to Dublin District Court, but Gardaí had resisted it, insisting the car was still a key piece of evidence. Over the course of the case, it was heard that Kerwin had been arrested on suspicion of withholding information from Gardaí, while Lawler was a suspect in the shooting. The court heard that Gardaí had been informed by lawyers for both Kerwin and Lawler that neither needed the vehicle to be forensically examined, and she had sent 3 letters looking for the car back. In evidence, lawyers said she was paying €500 a month for the car, which she couldn't use as it had been 3.5 months in possession of the Gardaí, and that she was under considerable pressure. In March 2009, Lawler claimed his next victim, David Fred Lynch, was shot 3 times in the head with a semi-automatic pistol and his body dumped on wasteland. The murder showed Gardaí that Lawler was not only a ruthless killer, but also a treacherous one. He was willing to take on and take out just about anyone. Lynch, a low-level thug known as Fred, was the father of a young boy. He was also a friend of Lawler's, but he was involved in disputes with a large number of criminals in the Coolock area, which had upped the murder rate in the district to staggering levels. His was the 12th gangland killing of that year. He'd left his mother's house on the afternoon of the 29th of March, telling her, "I'll be back in 10 minutes, I'm going to meet Robbie Lawler." The purpose of the meeting with Lawler and another associate, Noel Deans, was to dig up a gun on waste ground in Belcamp. When they retrieved the weapon, Lawler had shot Lynch without warning. More than a year later, another close friend of Lawler, Mr Big's hitman Kenneth Finn, was drinking with Deans in the Priorswood Inn in Coolock. Deans was drunk and was openly bragging that he'd been with Lawler when he shot Lynch. Finn phoned Lawler and told him what Deans was saying. When the pair left the pub at 10 p.m, they turned into a pedestrian lane where Lawler was waiting. He shot Deans in the head and body. Deans had been a classic, chaotic young criminal who was aged just 27 when he died. He'd spent most of his life in child detention centres and adult prisons, and was known as a disorganised criminal who was anti-establishment and up for any crime that would fund his drug habit. In 2000, aged 18, he was jailed for 4 years for using a stolen car to ram a Garda vehicle and then reverse over an officer on foot. His trial heard, he'd been smoking cannabis at 13 years of age before moving on to harder drugs like heroin and crack cocaine. At a later trial for another altercation with a Garda car and for attacking an officer, a judge was told that he was first jailed at 14 and over the preceding 7 years had been just 18 months out of custody. The court was also told he had psychiatric problems and a drug addiction. The murder of Deans was inevitable and nobody would avenge his death, but it certainly cemented Lawler's reputation as a cool and a calculated killer. As Lawler lurched in and out of feuding gangs, spent regular stints behind bars, and made it known that he was a gun for hire, a far more organised killer was about to make a name for himself on Dublin's north side. Despite their claims to be ridding the capital of drug dealers, in reality the Dublin branch of the real IRA, under the leadership of the suave womaniser Alan Ryan, were putting the heavy on dealers and criminals, intimidating them and extorting money from them. Ryan had been ambitious since taking charge of the dissident group and had gone for the big players as well as the small, quickly becoming a cause of concern for some real IRA bosses in the north who were worried that he'd become too powerful and a potential liability. His extortion rackets were worth hundreds of thousands of euros. Ryan, originally from Grange Abbey Drive in Donamead, was a skilled gunman and had first been jailed at 19 for attending a real IRA training camp. It was in 1999 when Ryan was caught along with older dissidents at Stamullen in County Meath, and while he awaited trial he was caught with a gun. The training camp had been targeted by the Garda's Special Detective Unit, designated to police dissident activity across the country. They watched as 10 men gathered at a farm and Gardaí discovered assault rifles, a submachine gun and a semi-automatic pistol in a cellar. Ryan received 4 years for his role in the camp and a separate 3 years on firearms charges. He quickly gained respect from dissidents while serving his sentence in Portlaoise. When he was released from jail, Ryan decided to go to war with the drug gangs, who were flooding the country with their product and making huge money. He demanded large sums of cash off them, and if they refused to pay up, they became targets for his feared dissident gang, who traded under the IRA name. Ryan had made plenty of enemies during his campaigns of extortion against the criminal gangs. Ryan became involved in a bitter dispute with Sean, the smuggler Hunt, when he turned to him for money and the Ballyfermot criminal refused. As part of the dispute, the real IRA were believed to have shot Colm Collie Owens, an associate of Hunt. Owens was shot at his workplace, the Corn Store Animal Feed Warehouse, at the Grove Industrial Estate in Finglas. Owens was best known for being an associate of Eamon the Don Dunn, the ruthless criminal who had taken over the Marlow Highland firm after the boss was killed. The shooting of Owens was casual. It had happened at midday and witnesses said the gunman had walked up to Owens and shot him up to 8 times at close range in front of several other employees. After the shooting, the gunman had escaped in a waiting silver Audi A4 car, which had driven in the direction of Finglas, colliding with 2 other cars at the Tolka Valley Road junction before being abandoned and burnt out. In a revenge attack, Hunt had enlisted Alan, Keith and John Wilson to murder Ryan at the Players' Lounge pub in Fairview, where he was a regular. The operation was a catastrophe. Instead of targeting Ryan, Alan Wilson had managed to shoot 3 innocent men, including the pub doorman, in a spray of bullets. The shooting attempt was like nothing Gardaí had seen before and was later described as a Narco-style drive-by shooting akin to mafia assassinations of the 1930s. CCTV showed a gunman opening fire with a fully loaded semi-automatic pistol, randomly spraying 9mm rounds at the pub and then making his getaway in a Volkswagen Golf, which was later torched. Ryan was incensed but not scared, and rather than backing off, he stepped up his activities and was believed to have killed drug dealer Sean Winters, who was shot twice in the head outside an apartment in Portmarnock in September 2010 in the immediate aftermath. A year later, Ryan would claim a far bigger player in an effort to rubber stamp his ability to extort from the big hitters of the underworld. But the murder of Michael the Panda Kelly would ultimately leave a clear path of progress for his underlings in the Mr. Big network. Kelly, originally from the Kilbarrack area, was regarded as the biggest player on Dublin's north side when he was hit up by Ryan and his cohorts for money, but he resisted handing over any of his spoils. The Panda was just 30 years old, but had risen through the ranks of the underworld by murdering rivals who'd got in his way. He'd a close relationship with the then heir to the Irish mafia, Daniel Kinahan, and was one of the few Dublin kingpins who was regularly seen in his company in Spain. He'd been a target of Cab, which had relieved him of a house in County Meath and 2 expensive cars. In an effort to mark their power, Ryan's Real IRA demanded a cut of his profits, but were laughed at. As a result, they killed him on the street outside the home he shared with new mum, Kiva Robinson. The daylight killing of Kelly at his home in Clongriffin would not only remove one of the most bloodthirsty criminals from the gangland scene, but it would clear a path for Mr. Big to take over the vast North Dublin turf that Kelly had controlled. Kelly, who was originally from Kilbarrack, earned his money through massive shipments of cocaine. Despite his strong connections with the Kinahan mob, he'd his own suppliers too. Over the course of his career, he'd ordered at least 6 murders, the first being an entirely innocent man, 23-year-old Keith Fitzsimons, who'd been killed in a case of mistaken identity near his home in Kilbarrack. 2 years later, he had rival Anto Russell shot dead in a pub in Artane, and 3 months after that, Anthony Foster was gunned down at his home in Coolock. At the same time, he'd employed Eric Lucky Wilson to help him settle his differences with the drug dealers David Babyface Lindsay and Alan Napper, who'd been lured to a rural property, killed, dismembered and disappeared. The Panda had terrorised local dealers in the wider Coolock neighbourhoods and ruled with an iron fist. After his death, the Real IRA claimed the murder, spray painting RIRA anti-drugs, Micah Kelly drug dealer dead, on a wall in their Northside stronghold. Within 1 month of his death, the PSNI had shut down the double murder investigation into the disappearance of Lindsay and Napper in 2008. Ryan felt empowered by the brazen takeout of such a big player on the drug scene, and he immediately turned his attentions to the veteran criminal Eamon Kelly, a mentor and elder to many gangsters, and the go-between for Dublin gangs with Christy the Dapper Don Kinahan, father of Daniel and by then the biggest wholesaler in Europe. It was during late 2011 and the first half of 2012 that tit-for-tat arguments with Mr. Big also intensified, and at one point Ryan's mob stole a large amount of money from the big organisation. Mr. Big had been busy raising funds so he could invest in larger drug shipments and had carried out a number of high-netting robberies, one of which involved the kidnap of a family over a lengthy period. In his mind, Mr. Big had earned his money and was not going to hand it over to anyone. The simple solution to the problem that Ryan had become was to shoot him, but criminals worried about what would follow the assassination of such a high-profile dissident figure. For decades, there had been a largely respectful relationship between the criminals and the terrorists who conducted their activities on an island divided by a border, and where, despite ceasefires and gun amnesties, an arsenal of gunpowder still existed in the north. OCGs had long preferred to keep the provos, and later groups like the Continuity IRA and the Real IRA happy, either through tithes or diplomatic sharing of resources. They also asked for permission if they wanted to interfere with any of their volunteers. But Ryan had shifted the balance, and the intensity of his demands had made him a lot of enemies, with connections deep in the northern dissident groups, where suspicions about him remained even within his own northern command. In a show of his own growing power base in North Dublin, Mr. Big stepped up to negotiate a plan. When it had been sanctioned by the Kinahans in Spain, he made his move. At 3:30 on the afternoon of the 3rd of September 2012, Ryan, then 32, was shot at Grange Lodge Avenue in Clongriffin as he walked along the streets towards his home. It was the place he felt safest and could never conceive that he'd be targeted there. As he collapsed on the ground, Mr. Big's hitman Kenneth Finn walked over and shot him in the head before escaping in a car which was later found burnt out in a graveyard. The murder was a bold move. It was the first time the criminals had put it up to the ruthless dissidents in such a high-profile way. For months, expectations grew that the wider northern command of the Real IRA would take bloody retribution for Ryan's death. Instead, little followed, save the assassination of the elderly criminal Eamon Kelly as he walked home from a bookie's office. The 65-year-old had escaped an attempt on his life, but believed he was safe with Ryan out of the picture. The daring murder of Ryan caused chaos within his own ranks and resulted in the merger of groups into a new movement called the New IRA, which was intent on cleaning up its image and restructuring into a disciplined force. The group included Real IRA, Republican Action Against Drugs, RAD, and Óglaigh na hÉireann members, along with a hardcore group of veteran provos who'd previously sat on the sidelines. While they did come out in force to mourn Ryan with a full colour party and shots fired over his grave, the reality was that the murdered dissident had been on a crash course with his own leadership for a long time, thanks to the intensity of his operations in Dublin and the levels of publicity that had followed. While dissident groupings publicly claimed Ryan as a hero, behind the scenes they had long had concerns about his high-profile activities, and many believed that, had he not been taken out by Mr. Big, he would have fallen foul of his own. Within weeks, the New IRA were interrogating his closest associates, and pals Nathan Kinsella and Declan Smith were quizzed and then shot in the legs under accusations that money that had been paid to the group had not made it to the war chest in the north. As the group looked inwards, they killed one of their own, Peter Butterley, who was shot dead outside the Huntsman's Inn in Gormanston, County Meath, in March 2013, as students waiting for their school bus looked on. 1 year later, with the movement still in chaos and its members under the close watch of the Special Detective Unit, Mr. Big saw another opportunity, this time targeting Ryan's right-hand man, Decky Smith. The 32-year-old died a week after being shot in the face as he dropped his son off at a creche. Originally from the Cliftonville Road in North Belfast, he'd been living in the Republic since 2007. Smith was vulnerable because he faced the twin threat of Mr. Big and the dissidents. He couldn't go back to the north because he was wanted there for questioning by the PSNI as a suspect in the murders of Edward Burns, 36, and Joe Jones, 38, both members of the Continuity IRA, who'd been beaten and killed in a row over money and missing weapons. But he'd made a schoolboy error when he decided to move to Coolock in an effort to hide in the vastness of its housing estates. By doing so, he'd placed himself in the heartland of Mr. Big's territory and given him the opportunity to watch his regular movements and come up with a plan. The entire scenario brought fame to Mr. Big in criminal circles, respect to his hitman Finn, and new opportunities for him to grow as a force to be reckoned with. While the big network grew in the Coolock area, fighting its way to power, Robbie Lawler would have been an obvious choice of a hitman for hire, but there were family reasons for not aligning with his one-time neighbour. Lawler had continued to move in and out of the prison system to grow his reputation as a hardened killer and enforcer. His relationship with Rachel Kerwin remained volatile, and at one point in December 2014 he was arrested and later charged with assault, causing harm to her at her home in Grangemore Crescent in Donamead. When he was caught a year later with a stolen car, he was handed down a hefty 16-month sentence due to how familiar his face had become in the dock of a courtroom. But while Lawler's life was chaotic, the same could not be said for his brother-in-law, Richie Carbury, who'd risen to become a serious player on the organised crime scene. Once a member of the same crew that Mr. Big had worked in, he decided that he wanted to go it alone and operate independently from the gang, now under the leadership of his former contemporary. Originally from Riversdale Drive in Coolock, Carbury wasn't into the dirty business of getting hands-on with his drug supply or with the murkier business of the world he lived in. He preferred to see himself as a boss and liked to remain below the radar as he muscled in on drugs turf and eyed up opportunities in the market. Married to Eileen Lawler's eldest sister, he'd become a father in 2003 when he was just in his early 20s. 5 years older than his brother-in-law, he was organising shipments, laundering money and building up a fortune for himself and his growing family throughout his 20s. A year after the birth of his first child, a daughter, he'd registered a business name, CMAC Construction, from his Coolock address with a co-owner, but it ceased operating within a year. By 2007, he'd registered his address in a more upmarket home at Castlemartin Drive in Bettystown, County Meath. He'd changed his occupation too, and was now the owner of Orsi Interiors. The move to Bettystown and the residential estate on the edge of the village was an opportunity for Carbury to live below the radar of police and away from the neighbourhoods where the notorious Mr. Big was becoming a force to be reckoned with. Bettystown had long been a holiday destination for North Dubliners before the Algarve or the Costa del Sol became an affordable reality. While it had once been a small country village, the growing population of Dublin and the knockout property prices of the Celtic Tiger had turned it into a bustling commuter town. Seaside cottages had made way for large housing estates and apartment complexes, and coffee shops and big supermarkets had sprung up to cater for the growing population. Carbury's business partner had moved to the County Meath countryside too, and together they set about protecting their corner of the cocaine market in Dublin. Carbury prided himself on being a family man and providing for his brood of 3 children, Cody, Charlie and Callum, who'd been born in quick succession. He doted on Eileen, lavishing her with gifts and holidays, and while neighbours believed the couple were simply successful business people, he feathered their nest with the proceeds of his lucrative drug trade. But Carbury's ambition was not satisfied with a new big home, a flash car or the facade of being upwardly mobile. He wanted more, and the nearby town of Drogheda and its burgeoning population of commuters caught his eye. By 2016, the census showed that the population of Bettystown, nearby Laytown and Mornington had doubled in the years since the new millennium, and that was before the surge of homeowners in the bigger town of Drogheda, located just a 15-minute drive from Bettystown. The area ticked many boxes for workers, including a regular direct train service to Connolly Station in the heart of the capital. Drogheda's population had swelled because of property refugees from Dublin who were simply priced out of the housing market there. The census showed that between them, Bettystown, Laytown and Mornington had a population of around 34,000, while Drogheda by then housed over 44,000 people. The nearby Fingal constituencies of Balbriggan and Swords had combined populations of more than 125,000, making the whole area rival Waterford, Galway and Limerick in terms of population. Surveys estimated that around 20,000 people left Drogheda every day to travel to work. A young and wealthy cohort who mainly came back to their commuter towns to socialise and to take cocaine. I'm Nicola Tallant and you're watching Crime World, a podcast about criminals, drugs and the underworld in Ireland and across the globe. Make sure you subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you can be the first to watch all our latest episodes. You can also listen wherever you get your podcasts.